Okay, so where we begin this episode is the natural next step after taking the engine apart. It's time to reassemble the thing. And with no time to waste, let's just jump right into it, folks. Let's start it off with removing the pistons. Removing pistons is as easy as removing the little wrist pin clips. There are two on each side, but to remove pistons that you have no plan to reuse, you could just remove one of them and slide out the pin that way. Once you get the clip out, you can just drive the pin through that side. Now, I'm replacing the pistons, yes, but I removed them just now in order to get access to the base gasket surface. Yeah, even though Clayton took care of the cylinder to head surface, I would still have to scrape off the cylinder to block surfaces. But this is a lot less anxiety inducing because it's a non-compression surface. You still want to be careful, but it's not the end of the world. And this was the best that I could do with that. There's still some dark spots, but even passing a fingernail over those areas, I can't feel them, so that's good enough for me. I did the same with the underside of the cylinders and made preparations to hone them. For an engine of this displacement, I'm using a 2 3/8 inch ball hone. Kind of looks like a toilet bowl cleaner, but each little ball has grit on it to cross-hatch the cylinder walls. Cylinders will glaze over and be too smooth for new piston rings to wear into place, so you have to, kind of texture the walls when you're installing new rings. Just make sure you oil everything up and attach it to a drill. It's very simple. The key here is to just make sure that the drill is spinning before you enter the cylinder and it's still spinning after you remove it. So you never want to stop it while it's in the bore. In order to make sure you're actually getting the entire bore, you also want to drill the hone out a little bit at each end. So you see how I'm coming out of the cylinder? Now you'll end up with this like slurry of metal, grit, and oil, and you gotta clean it up thoroughly because you don't really want that sticking around. Here you can see the crosshatch pattern, and that's what's needed to properly seat new piston rings. Wiping out the cylinders is not enough though. You gotta actually wash them with dish soap and water, and then wipe them out with automatic transmission fluid. ATF darkens when it's contaminated, and it also prevents any flash rusting because it's an oil. After all that, I just put the cylinders away, and then I shifted my attention to the head. The task here is to lap the valves, which is a process in which you put grinding compound on the edge of the valves where they meet the seat on the head. And this allows you to grind flat any imperfections that would affect the ability for the valves to seal completely. I scraped off what carbon I could off the bodies of the valves, but I don't have a media blaster or anything like that, and I didn't want to get too goofy on these things and then mess something up trying to make them look perfect. What I really care about is the ability to seal. All you do is put grinding compound around the edges and spin the valves in the seat with a suction cup. That's pretty much it. You can hear the grit in the compound getting higher and higher pitched as the surface gets smoother and the grit wears out. Lifting and rotating the valve a little bit will let you grind a little bit more. And you know you're done when the sound of the pitch increase happens super fast. After that, it was time to give the cylinder head one last wash before I go ahead and install the valves. Here's a full rebuild kit from Vesra that comes with basically almost everything you need to seal up your engine, but not quite everything. First part of the valve install is the valve stem seal. Now, these little seals keep oil from flowing down the valve stem into the cylinder. It's actually a common reason why cars may start, engines in general may start burning oil is when these little seals go bad. So you go ahead and coat the valve stems in some assembly lube and they'll seat themselves into the seals. Then comes the springs, retainers, and washers. Same as removing them, but in reverse, obviously. The most annoying part is getting those little valve keepers in there, but you get better at doing it as you go. In fact, those keepers are such a pain that I didn't even bother filming them because I was too focused on getting it done, which is something that happens sometimes. But as you can see, the head is fully reassembled and good to go. So I went ahead and put that to the side because I still had the pistons to replace. These are box standard bore, standard comp, nothing special. They come with wrist pins, clips, and rings. You get 5 rings for CB550. You got 3 oil rings and 2 compression rings. So I went ahead and I put the 3 oil rings on for all 4 of them, but I had to wait to install a compression ring because you have to measure the ring end gap, and I lost my feeler gauges. So I ran to AutoZone to get some feeler gauges and returned to install the compression rings. To be honest, I'm still not entirely clear on the values here because I felt like I was getting different answers from different places using this gap size that you see in the video. To install the pistons, you put a pin clip on the side facing away from you. Then you connect the piston to the con rod using the pin. Then you install the other pin clip, obviously with assembly lube at every point of contact. Base gasket goes on with these little O-rings around the oil passage dowels at either end of the block. The cylinders themselves also have these little, well, not little, they're pretty big O-rings that go around the cans. And you can also see the beautiful crosshatch pattern that's still in the cylinders. At this point, you can go ahead and coat the cylinder walls with assembly lube, along with that little bit of ATF that's already in there. And you can also see I reinstalled the cam chain tensioner. When I went to reinstall the cylinders, the camera actually ran out of storage right here. And unfortunately, I didn't notice until I got the cylinders on there. It was pretty simple though, just keep everything lined up and get cylinders 2 and 3 lined up, and then once those get in, you can bring up 1 and 4 and then just work them all in there. It was definitely easier than getting them off with all that corrosion on it. Next part of the sandwich is the head gasket. Just like the base gasket, there's 2 O-rings that go on the oil passages at either end. I just stacked the head on top loosely, and I returned another day with an actually usable camera. And at this point, I installed the stud nuts to tighten everything down using a center outward crisscross pattern. Okay, so camshaft time. To install a camshaft on a CB550 and have it timed correctly, you turn cylinders 1 and 4 to top dead center, and you install a camshaft with this little notch, this little machine notch, level with the engine surface that it sits on. You lock it in place with the sprocket and chain, and then you torque down those bolts. I put the top rocker cover on and I coated the gasket with silicone so it would stay in place, because that thing likes to fall out when you're trying to install. If you remember, I had that one pesky bolt over there on the left, your left, the one that I had to drill out. Well, I tried to retap the threads and I failed, so I simply doubled up on the silicone in that area. You know, the JIS screws don't really do much of the torque up here anyway. After that, I went ahead and I adjusted the valve clearances as per the manual spec. In order to make sure the engine was actually sealing, I went ahead and did some compression tests. The engine is not broken and it's obviously cold, it's largely dry, but you can still get an idea of what's going on. I mean, those oil rings use oil to further seal a combustion chamber, so I sprayed some oil down into the cylinders to help them seal and boost compression, but I was wildly inconsistent in some cases, which gave me some differing numbers. I don't have an oil can, the little dolloping oil can. So I was basically just pouring it down the bores. Cylinder 4 was reading 160 psi, cylinder 3 was reading 160 psi, cylinder 2 was reading 145 psi, which I suspect is because I didn't put as much oil down there as the first two, because cylinder 1 was reading 220 psi, where I suspect I threw too much oil in. I'll do another test when a bike is at normal operating state, but right now, I at least know there's compression, so that's good enough for me. Oh, and speaking of normal operating state, the next day me and my pops were able to bring the engine out the same way we brought it in, a tie-down strap and a wood plank. There's a few strategies for getting the engine back in the frame when you're alone, but with 2 of us, it was just as easy as lifting it up and dropping it back. It maybe took 2 minutes max. You guys saw me remove the motor mounts and stuff, you know, same thing in reverse. Oh, and you remember that rig I made with the tile and the sandpaper? I actually used it to level the intake manifolds, as this will help make sure that there's no air leaks. You seal those up with O-rings too. Now I opted to run the old plugs since they were already gapped. They didn't look too bad, and I could use them to burn off the various oils inside the cylinder, you know, engine oil, lube, ATF, you know, rather than exposing new plugs to that type of stuff. After a while, I had everything hooked up, and I was good to run the engine. I just needed some engine oil. I went with 1040 mineral oil, and I know there's a technicality with going from synthetic to mineral, but I can't be bothered to even look it up. With the ignition off, I ran the starter to prime the oil pump and begin circulating oil around the engine. You know, the engine will appreciate that on actual startup. All that cranking, all that cranking killed the battery, so I got a jump pack and I boosted it. The engine fires, but it's extra loud because in my haste, I forgot to install those little copper crush washers at the exhaust headers, so I reckon it's making that exhaust leak noise, that high pitch. That then made me think about installing the muffler to hear the engine more instead of hearing the exhaust. But that's actually still at my apartment, so. But anyway, it runs. I mean, it hasn't exploded. But when I tell you my cynicism would not let me accept this, I was basically like, there's no way I just got away with engine work, right? My willingness to accept Murphy's Law is what keeps me humble. And I will have to run it a few more times to be fully convinced. I have to check a few things, but for now, I'm definitely grateful that it even runs. I ran a makeshift oil pressure light, and the light wasn't grounded on the switch, implying that there was indeed good oil pressure. I also checked the insides of the tappet covers and saw the oil was indeed flowing up to the head. I mean, look, it's idling consistently. After the initial smoke, the exhaust is coming out pretty clean. Good signs. I want to double check timing, valve clearance, compression, and that oil pressure switch next time. I want to see it go off. You know what I'm saying? So I want to see it on and then turn it back on and it goes off. I didn't really get to see that this time. But for now, I think I'm done. Next time I would like to begin the M-unit rewire process because I'm just done with these crappy electrics and I need the bike to actually pass inspection. That'll happen when it happens. I just gotta purchase everything and not end up broke afterwards. I did a lot of good work over the past few days, but unfortunately that meant that I left a pretty big mess of tools and parts. But don't worry, you guys can see yourselves out. I'll handle the cleanup. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.